first off, I want to apologize for sitting down. I had back surgery not too long ago and some leg surgery, so it's just easier to stay seated. So I hope that doesn't offend anyone, but I can't stand for a long period of time anymore, at least for now. I'm working on it though. So yeah, I'm James Wadsworth. Today we're going to talk about the Charlatan in the Backlands. This is an inquisitional case that I discovered while I was doing my dissertation research. It became an article, and this is the first time I'm actually presenting this research outside of the article. So it's been a fun story. I've always presented to students, but never actually in a public forum before. So we'll just go ahead and dive in. I want to start off with the kind of end of the story, actually. On around midnight on a Sunday, on November 8th, 1739, in the port city of Salvador, Bahia, an imposter named Friar Januario de San Pedro, alias Friar Jose de Gareta, knocked on the door of the Comisario of the Inquisition in Bahia, and he delivered to him a prisoner whose name was João de Souza Pereira. Januario had imprisoned João de Souza in late September, some 6 weeks earlier, and traveled through the backlands with him and brought him all the way into Bahia to deliver to the Comisario of the Inquisition. The Comisario, understandably, at midnight was not super happy to have this guy knocking on his door, and so he tells him, look, just send him off to the Franciscan monk convent. We'll hold him there, in prison there. You come back to me tomorrow and tell me what's going on with this guy. So Januario did, but he never appeared the next day. In fact, he was still at home when the viceroy actually sent soldiers to imprison him for being an impostor. And he was then kept in the Discalced Carmelite convent as a prisoner until he was sent to Lisbon on a ship to be tried by the Inquisition. The Inquisition received him here at the Paseo, which is the famous Inquisitional Palace in Lisbon. It no longer exists. It was burned down in the 19th century. But he was delivered there on September 26, 1740. And so this is the kind of end of his career as an imposter. But his story actually raises important questions about the nature of inquisitional power in colonial Brazil in the mid-18th century. And also questions about how he managed to pass as a fake priest and a fake Comisario of the Inquisition for so long. And it raises questions like, didn't anybody notice that he was a fake? How did he pull this off? If they did notice he was a fake, why didn't they do something about it? And why did he choose to pretend to be an inquisitional official in the backlands of Brazil, where very few inquisitional officials ever trod? And also, what was it about the nature of inquisitional power that he was faking that allowed him to succeed as long as he did? And then, of course, what finally destroyed his facade? What gave him away? Why did he finally end up being captured and punished by the Inquisition? So for too long, in our public imagination about the Inquisition, we have this idea of the all-powerful institution that could basically do whatever it wanted to whomever it wanted. And Januario's case actually reveals that the story of inquisitional power was much more nuanced, and I think therefore much more interesting than we often assume. So I want to start off talking about imposture a little bit. So imposture in all its various forms remained a continuous problem for the Inquisition all throughout its 285-year existence in the Portuguese Empire. When the Inquisitors discussed imposture, they used three phrases. The first was the phrase fingir, which means, of course, to fake, falso, which means false, and then passar, which means to pass. So these terms referred virtually to any kind of imposture you can imagine. There were men and women who dressed as men and ran around as cross-dressers. There were men and women who engaged in bigamy and fake marriages. There were fake visionaries. There were fake priests. There were fake officials of the Inquisition. The whole range of imposture you would expect to find. What's interesting about imposture is that the inquisitional law was far more developed than Portuguese law was in dealing with imposture. Portuguese law prohibited things like people who faked falsified weights and measures and things like that. But the Inquisition had been far more interested in it because imposture was one of those things that actually tarnished the reputation of the Inquisition. And so they saw it as a very negative thing, and they tried to police it early on. We do have evidence that as early as 1545, the Inquisition was already beginning to deal with it. But they didn't lay out any formal instructions until 1640 in their new bylaws. They're called a regimento, is the word for bylaws. And that's when they began to deal with it. The 1640 Regimento actually created two broad categories. The first were obstructors, and the second was impostors. So those people who obstructed the good name of the Inquisition, there are actually 660 cases of these that you can find in the records of the Portuguese Inquisition, and yet no one has ever studied them. So that's a big area that we need to study. Under the Inquisition's criteria, impostors included those who falsified inquisitional orders, took prisoners in the name of the Holy Office, without orders, or impersonated inquisitional officials. And the punishments for these things could be fairly severe, including whipping, banishment, the restitution of any extorted items or money. But the Inquisitors could also use a wide range of punishments they had at their disposal, like banishment, sending people into the galleys and things like that. So this graph shows that we have at least 84 cases of known imposture that appear in the Inquisitional records. There might be more, but these are the ones that were readily available. There are two periods, I tried to mark them so hopefully you can see them, where we see a clear increase in imposture in the Inquisition. There's the 80-year period between 1620 and 1700. This accounts for 22 of the cases, or 26.2% of all the imposture cases. The second period, it's a 50-year period between 1726 and 1775, and this accounts for about 28%, or 28 cases, or about 33% of the inquisitional cases. So if we combine these two periods together, that's about 59.2% of the cases of imposture. So the majority of the cases of imposture in the 285-year existence of the Portuguese Inquisition occurred in these two periods. So the first period, I want to show you another one. So try and memorize this as best you can. So the next one, just so I'll explain it so you can understand what's going on. So in this graph, it shows the sentences. On the left side where it shows number 1, the high numbers are all the sentences. And what you can see is the sentences are really high in those early years, and then they plummet by the early decades of the 18th century, and then the two things cross. The other thing that's crossing are the people who became familiares of the Inquisition. The familiares were the lay officials of the Inquisition. So what's happening, something is going on at the beginning of the 18th century where there's a massive transformation in the Inquisition. It's ceasing to become an institution of repression and becoming an institution of social promotion. So, but what's interesting is if you go back to this slide, now compare the kind of years and look at the peaks. Those peaks are happening at roughly the same time as we see these episodes of activity in the Inquisition. So in the first period, this is a period where we see increased activity because the Inquisition is really engaged in repressing people. This is a high, and this is the era when they were mostly going after crypto-Jews, so people who were baptized Christians who were practicing Judaism. But others, it was primarily, in the Portuguese Inquisition, it was always primarily crypto-Jews. Then the second period is actually quite different. Rather than being engaged in repressing, this is the period when thousands of people across the empire are applying to become officials of the Inquisition. And that's what if you're a comisario or an official of the Inquisition in this era, this is what your work was primarily focused on, promoting people to become Inquisitional officials. That's what you did, was investigation into their ancestry so they could become officials of the Inquisition. So this is interesting because these two periods coincide, and they show that precisely the moment when the Inquisition is assuming a more active public role, either in repression or in social promotion, we see more cases of imposture. And this is because when the Inquisition is more actively engaged, there's more opportunity now for people to actually assume the role of an Inquisitional official. So that's the kind of context for the imposture. In terms of Brazil, what's going on, Januari's story is taking place against the backdrop of the early 18th century Iberian colonial world. This is a world in which Spain and Portugal were still at odds with each other. They were still fighting quite seriously over the Amazon basin and the Rio de la Plata, or the Uruguay, Paraguay, southern Brazil region. And they actually, in 1735 to 37, a war, the war called the Banda Oriental, actually opened up and was pretty heated for 2 years. In fact, it was going on at precisely the time Januari comes through this region. So despite this rivalry, though, people could move. There was a lot of movement between the different communities. And so we might think there would be cultural barriers. People did have to have passports, but there are ways to wiggle around those kind of things in this world. And so Januwadi has no difficulty in traveling from Quito, where he started, all the way down through Argentina and up into northern Brazil. The other context, so that's the map that kind of shows his journey. We'll come back to this several times so you can see it. The other context I want to mention briefly is the context of the sertão. The sertão, the word means backlands. So it's really the back country. It's the area in the interior of Brazil, away from where the most population was along the coast. In the late 17th century, the Brazilians began to move inland into the interior. There were several wars against indigenous population that went on, but also this is primarily about access to ranching lands, but also access to the mines, the gold mines and the diamond mines of the interior of Minas Gerais. So the backlands, though, still lives in the Brazilian imagination as this kind of liminal space. It was possible, especially in this era, to escape the constraints of colonial society in this region. Runaway slaves came to this region and established what they called quilombos. So these are runaway slave societies that could exist on their own out in the backlands. Deserters from the military and pressman gangs would go here. Criminals, social deviants of all kinds, sought out and found refuge in this tumultuous frontier region of the sertão. The sertão also served as a frontier where the governmental authority was diffuse and sometimes non-existent. So what this meant was you have this weak colonial system in many ways that provides a space for people who want to adjust their own identities to transcend boundaries. They can do this in the backlands. They can liberate themselves from the constraints of their society. So in the 1730s, when Januwadi was coming through this region, this is the region where the rush to the mines is starting to slow down in the 1730s. We're starting to see the population spread out a little bit more. There are more towns and villages developing along the roads. And there's a huge mixed race population that's emerging in this region. Partly mixing with European ancestry, mixing with indigenous people, but also with African people. And they could have important roles. The gentleman on the far right is actually a slave hunter. He's a mixed race slave hunter. What he does is he goes into the interior, he hunts down slaves who run away from their masters, captures them and brings them back home. So this was also going on. So we have municipal councils are starting to emerge as these villages settle in. So there is some government presence there, but it's always thin and sometimes hard to reach. The kind of most powerful people in this region were the cattle ranchers and the manioc farmers. So manioc was a common food resource. It's indigenous to Brazil. And cattle was always being used because the cities had a desperate need for food. And so then sertão became this region where the food was being produced for the cities. And so we had this kind of, this high upper class of the cattle ranchers, manioc farmers who got all the wealth and power. They were served by slaves, both black and indigenous. Poor whites were often working in pretty menial conditions, often on the very edge of survival, on the brink of starvation. The church also has a presence in the backland, but it's struggling in these years. The church hasn't quite set up a consistent network of priests in these regions. In fact, most villagers in the sertão probably never saw a priest in their lives, or only saw them once or twice in their entire lifetimes. Unless they lived along the kind of main roads, the main paths in the interior, then you could find priests fairly easily. But anytime outside of those regions, it can be quite difficult. And so there you have a picture here. The one is from the Conselheiro, so it's 1890, so it's very different. But you still have this tradition of these kind of wandering mystics and itinerant priests that roamed around the backland, often espousing religious ideas that the people on the coast didn't understand or like. And so very often these people became targets of the ecclesiastical and secular authorities on the coastal regions who would come and try and suppress them. So the Inquisition also had a presence here, although it was, again, even more minimal than was the presence of the church. It never managed to establish a viable network in the sertão. There are a few familiares scattered around the deep interior here and there. There are no comissários in the interior. In fact, in this region, 1739, there were no more than 41 officials of the Inquisition in the entire Captaincy General of Pernambuco. No more than 41, with a population that's well over several hundred thousand, and an area that's absolutely massive. So this kind of inexperience then of the sertanejos, these people in the backland, creates an opening for people like Januwadi. It's a little bit easier for him to carry on his facade where he's dealing with people who do not have a lot of deep experience with ecclesiastical authority, secular authority, and certainly not with the authority of the church. So this is the world that January was stepping into. It's a world on the move. It's a world of people trying to make a life for themselves in this rugged frontier region, and it has all the kind of stereotypes you think of as a frontier region are applicable here. Bandits are running amok. The roads are not safe, right? So it's a dangerous place, and this is where January, this place January wanders into, and becomes an imposter for about 4 years. So what I want to do now is I want to shift and actually give you an account of his experience. What happened with January? What's going on with this story? I've taken this account from the 200 manuscript pages of testimony that was gathered by the Portuguese Inquisition starting in 1740. And it shows the kind of interconnections of this colonial world and this society where boundaries of all kinds could be crossed, and in fact were crossed. Both secular and religious officials often struggle to hold the seams of society together in this frontier region. So January de San Pedro actually was born around 1704 and was raised in Quito, Ecuador. We do not know his father's occupation, but we do know that he lived by his estate, which means he had enough money to probably not have to actually work. What he did, we don't know. His maternal grandfather had been the governor of Vizcaya, so they probably had lands somewhere. It's unclear how wealthy his family was, but they could at least afford to send him to school. We do know that he studied grammar and Latin and philosophy and medicine here under the Jesuits at the famous University of San Gregorio Magno in Quito. In mid to late 1734, so he was about 30 years of age at this point, Januario served as a professed lay brother of the Dominican order in the convent either in Quito or one in Guayaquil. The records say both, so I don't know which one it is, but it's somewhere in either Guayaquil or Quito. And as a lay brother, what Januario was doing, he had taken the vows of poverty and chastity and obedience, but he had not been ordained. So he was not a priest, he was simply a lay brother. And this meant he couldn't participate in things like the choir or any of the holy offices that would be allowed to a priest. In the early 18th century, what this meant, being a lay brother, meant that he was serving as an assistant to the priest. So he did all the menial tasks. He was the one who had to clean things, he had to organize things, he had to run errands and stuff. And this he didn't like. The reason why the lay brothers did this was to allow the priests the opportunity to engage in their own studies, their own work of the ministry. That was the whole point of this. But he saw this as demeaning. He said in his testimony to the Inquisition, he said that he was weary of continually serving the community in the most difficult and toilsome tasks. He also claimed that he was jealous. He was jealous of the priests. He was jealous of Inquisition officials. The people in his life that he saw that had the most prestige and received the most respect were always priests or officials of the Inquisition. And so he claimed that he therefore coveted the priestly office. So we don't know why he couldn't be ordained. It's not clear from the records. It could be that he didn't have enough financial support because in order to be ordained, you had to prove that you could support yourself. But he comes from a fairly wealthy family, as far as we can tell, so that doesn't seem to be the issue. I think it was probably because there were already concerns raised about his moral fiber, as his later career shows, right? So, to accomplish by cunning what he couldn't accomplish apparently by merit, what Januario did was he decided to forge a letter from his provincial, the Father Friar Jose Enrique. And in the forged letter, he indicated that he possessed all the necessary capacity and aptitude, and that any bishop could ordain him to the priesthood. So right there we have a problem. By the orders of the Council of Trent, this could not happen. It wasn't just any bishop, it had to be your bishop. And if it wasn't your bishop, then your bishop had to recommend you. So he's already broken the boundaries here by claiming any bishop can appoint him. So to make his letter more convincing, what Januario did was he carefully imitated the provincial signature. He practiced to make sure he could make it look just like the provincial signature so he could sign it. Then he had a record from the provincial with the provincial seal on it. He peeled the seal off and carefully glued it to his forged letter. So it looked really official, right? It looked like a legitimate letter. So with his forged letter in hand, he fled to the Dominican convent in Lima. So I circled in red kind of where he's headed. So he heads down from Quito down to Lima. He didn't go to Quito because at the time, the bishop's seat in Quito was unoccupied at this time, which is maybe why he decided to do this when he did. his bishop wasn't there, right? There was no bishop in Quito at the time. So maybe that's why he did it. So he stayed some months in the Dominican convent in Lima, acting as if he were legitimate religious with the right to sit in the choir. He presented his letter to the archbishop, Juan Francisco Antonio de Escandon, and said, you know, I'm here for you to ordain me. But the archbishop delayed. Why he delayed, I don't know. The records don't say. But it may be that he'd already gotten word through the grapevine that there was something wrong with this guy named Johnny Waddy who was appearing. Or it may be he read the letter and he understood that this was in breach of the Council of Trent, and he couldn't just ordain him. And he was probably seeking information from his prelate, who Johnny Waddy had escaped. So, well, Johnny Waddy realizes this isn't going to work. He's actually in trouble. So he flees yet again. This time he takes a ship and goes all the way down to Santiago, Chile. He again stayed in Santiago, Chile for some months, where he roomed with a friar whose name was Jose Igareta. Igareta was called away on a short journey, and so he left behind his papers, which included his letter of ordination and several letters of recommendation. So here's Johnny Waddy, already engaging in an imposture that's probably going to get him in trouble. And he looks around and says, here's an opportunity. He takes Jose Igareta's letter of ordination and his letter of recommendation, and he flees. He goes across the mountains to Tucumán. He's traveling over the Andes down into Tucumán from Santiago, Chile, trying to escape. And this time he's taken Igareta's papers with him. When he gets to Tucumán, he presents the papers and his forged letter to the bishop, or the provincial father in Quito, to the bishop in Tucumán from the provincial father in Quito that he had forged. And he asks him to ordain him. But the problem is, when he gets there, the bishop already has had word of him from his provincial father back in Quito, telling him, you need to punish this man because he's an impostor. Well, once Johnny Waddy figures that out, he does what he always does. He ran for it. So this time, he traveled all the way down to Buenos Aires, and then he crossed over the Rio de la Plata to Nueva Colonia de Sacramento. And there, he decided he's going to have to change. Up to this point, he's maintained his identity as Johnny Waddy. But when he gets to Nueva Colonia, it's as if he in crossing over the Rio de la Plata, he decides he's now going to cross another boundary. He's going to assume somebody else's identity. So he starts assuming the identity of Jose Igareta. And while he's there, he starts holding mass, he starts baptizing people, he starts hearing confessions, and then he joins a ship that's going to sail to Bahia as the chaplain aboard this ship. All of this proves at the time when what Johnny Waddy was doing is now practicing being an actual priest, is what he's doing. And he's doing it in a context where he can move around. He's changing audiences as necessary. But he ends up taking ship and getting all the way up to Salvador Bahia. He goes and takes his stolen credentials and he gives them to the Archbishop in Bahia, Don Luis Alvarez de Figueiredo, who on April 13, 1735, authorized Johnny Waddy to say Mass and exercise all the functions of a priest inside the Archdiocese of Bahia, as long as he was there in port until his ship sailed. So this kind of fortuitous acquisition of Jose Igareta's papers presented these opportunities for Johnny Waddy to take on a new identity, to establish a new biography that he could present to the world as if it were real. But, like all biographies, this biography places limits on what you can and can't do. He had to be consistent in his behavior in order to continue to pass as a priest. If he slips up too much in front of the same audience, there's going to be questions about who he is. So what he does, he stays a few months in Salvador, about 4 months in Salvador, until the fleet then left for Pernambuco to Lisbon. He said he wanted to go to Portugal. Why he wanted to go to Portugal is not clear. It may be that he was just trying to get the heck out of Latin America entirely, because clearly his fame is preceding him in some context. So during his, then what happened is he took his ship left Salvador and was heading north to Recife, but it got caught in a storm. And it was blown ashore at Sergipe, at the town of Aracaju, and he disembarked there, and he spent about 5 or 6 months in Sergipe. While he was in Sergipe, he started carrying around a portable altar. Now, what this altar was isn't clear from the records. It could have been an actual portable altar like the one on the right, or it could have been this thing here called a petrarca, which is just a stone, usually a limestone. It was often consecrated, or it had a piece of consecrated host inside it. And this was used as an altar. So what you could do is you could take this and you could go and set it under on the table where you're going to hold mass, or set it under the table, and it would consecrate the table so that you could properly say the mass with proper respect to the sacrament. We don't know exactly what kind he had, but he was holding mass regularly, traveling around with this portable altar. Then, while he was there, a new opportunity presented itself to Joaquin Marquez. He came across a group of people somewhere in the backcountry of Sergipe who were surrounding a dog that had a breve de mareia tied around its neck. So a breve de mareia is actually an amulet. Something like this. They were often called bolsa de mandinga. And these amulets were worn. They were inside a cloth pouch usually. They could have things in them like stones, gunpowder was often stuck in them, bullets, coins, human hair, feathers, animal skins, other sacred particles like pieces of the host, scraps of paper like these that could have images written on them or sacred words written on them. Often they were written in Latin or mostly Latin. So Januario is coming across this crowd surrounding the dog, and this dog's got this amulet tied around his neck. So he asked one of the people standing around, he said, what are you doing? And the guy said, well, some of us want to purchase this breve de mareia. The point of the breve de mareia was it was supposed to protect the individual who wore it from all injuries from any weapon. So he said, we're debating whether we should shoot the dog or not. Because if we can shoot the dog and it doesn't take an injury, well, then we'll buy the breves. If the dog takes an injury, then I'm not buying it. And so Januario says, oh, this is a good opportunity. He declares to the crowd, excuse me, I am a commissar of the Inquisition. I have been sent by the Inquisition to collect all of these amulets. So many people assume he is, because he said he was, and they start handing over these amulets to him. Januario later claimed that he gave the amulets to the bishop with an account of the damage they were doing in the interior. Other people didn't believe him. They said that what he did was he went over to the next town and sold them so he could make a profit on them. What's interesting is he never actually met with the Bishop of Pernambuco. The one time he did try to meet with him, the bishop refused to meet him. There's no possible way he could have delivered those amulets to the bishop because he never met him. So I think it's more likely he sold them. Januario then passed on from Sergipe into Minas Gerais to a Capuchin mission village called Aldeias. And there he acted as a missionary. He found out he really enjoyed missionary work. He was asked to deliver a sermon to the indigenous population there, and he gave a sermon that he had read when he was an acolyte back in Quito. He memorized it, and so he just gave the sermon that he had memorized. He only stayed there for about a month. Then he moved on to a place called Pajaú, where he began working with the indigenous population. He ended up baptizing a bunch of them, and now suddenly he discovered that he had a real zeal for missionary work. So he decided he was going to go all the way back to Recife and beg the bishop to invest more resources in the missionary programs in the interior. So he travels all the way back, but the bishop, José Fialho, refuses to meet him because he's gotten word that this guy's out there and he might be a fake. So he doesn't see it. And instead, what Fialho does is he sends out an order for a village priest to make an inquiry into Januario's conduct in the interior. Somehow, while he was in Recife, he also got his hands on the mail. How he did this, I have no idea, but he got his hands on the mail, and he rummaged through it and found a letter about him in the mail. And the letter was a letter being sent out to the priests in the region saying, we need to investigate this guy. He claims he put the letter back in the mail. I'm not sure I believe it, because that would be a really dumb thing to do. But nonetheless, that's what he claims he did. But by the way, this is a breach of royal law. You're not supposed to mess with the mail. It's illegal now. It was illegal then. But he did it anyway. So his performance now is becoming much more complicated. He's got the issues where up in the kind of the higher echelons of society, rumors are circulating now about him. Information is being passed around. So he's got to do something, and he realizes that. So by 1738, the Archbishop of Bahia was already aware of Januario. He had actually sent out an order for his arrest. But Januario managed to escape. And he did this because he didn't stay put for very long. He just kept moving. And so he's constantly on the move, constantly changing his audience. And so he's able to kind of get away with this for a long time. But what happens now is he breaks the basic rule of passing. He ceases to be consistent. However consistent he had been so far, he breaks that rule. And his later behavior shows that he's messing up. And this really begins when he's given an enameled medallion of the familiar. So I'll come back to this, but this is the enameled medallion of a familiar. All the familiares who were appointed by the Inquisition received this medallion. It was one of the symbols of office. It was supposed to be an exclusive thing that set them apart. And so he got this because somebody gave it to him as an alms from a sugar plantation when he was off in the interior. And he suddenly says, aha, now I have an opportunity. Now I can actually claim to be an official of the Inquisition because I have a symbol that is only given to the official of the Inquisition. His problem was he couldn't decide which official he wanted to be. Sometimes he was a familiar, which is the lay officials. Sometimes he was a commissario, which is the high clerical officials, the people who ran the business of the Inquisition in the society. Sometimes he was a qualificador. And it just depended on what served him best at the time. But people begin to notice this. But still, what happens is he's running around wearing this medallion, and he's telling people he's an official of the Inquisition. And even though his behavior is being erratic, people don't really know how to distinguish between a fake official and a legitimate official because they've never seen one in this backcountry region. So he gets away with it for a while. But his behavior proves that he doesn't understand what he's doing here. He does not understand the nature of inquisitional procedure, certainly not in Brazil. His knowledge was far too thin for him to use this as passing. His understanding of the Inquisition was a Spanish one, and it was in kind of a Quito context. It wasn't in the backlands of colonial Brazil where things functioned quite differently. But he didn't know that. And the problem was he began acting in ways that began to shatter his front. People began to question who he was and what he was doing. Still, word did spread that a commissario was in the region, and so people automatically came to him and started denouncing their neighbors for different crimes. And John Awadis loving this. He takes it all in, and he has them sit down. He makes them swear an oath, and they give their testimony. He writes it all down. He reads it back to them. He's trying to do the whole thing the way he thinks it's supposed to work, although he's actually doing it wrong. So then what he does is, what happens is he ends up getting a denunciation about this guy. Oh, sorry, there's another. He didn't get the cart as far as I know, but every familiar or commissario would have had a letter like this. It's on parchment. Look how beautiful it is. It's got a nice button. It's got the stamp of it with the arm of the Inquisition in it with a nice green ribbon. They would have had this and been able to show this to people to demonstrate their authority. He did not have one. He only had the medallion, which gets him in trouble later on. But so he's misbehaving here. Inquisitional officials don't do this. If somebody brings a denunciation to you, your job is to write down the denunciation and then send it off to Lisbon. It's inquisitors and the deputies in Lisbon who make the decisions about who's going to be investigated, not a commissario on the ground. He never had that authority, but he was doing it anyway. And any commission he had would have stated its authority, would have specifically listed the questions he was allowed to ask. All that kind of stuff would have been spelled out. By this time, they had printed documents they'd mailed to people. So, but he didn't have that, so he didn't know what he was doing. Also, inquisitional investigations like this were supposed to be done in the utmost secrecy. You're not supposed to announce it to the whole world what you're doing. And John Awadio does this. Everybody knows what he's up to. He's sending out letters willy-nilly to people, calling them to come serve with him. And this is just completely legitimate behavior for a commissario of the Inquisition. And even people in the backland would have begun to see there's something not right about this guy and what he's doing. Well, this is where he gets João de Souza Pereira. He's a manioc farmer and a widower, and Joaquim Marques Januario collects no fewer than 13 witnesses between September 23rd and 29th of 1739, who claimed that João de Souza had murdered his wife because she had seen him whipping an image of Christ and had threatened to denounce him. Several witnesses claimed that João de Souza's wife had said, quote, "If I had known he was of that race," by which she meant Jewish, "I would not have married him." Several witnesses also seem to support the accusation by declaring that João de Souza was a new Christian, so meaning he was descended from Jews who converted to Christianity. But the witnesses didn't agree on the method of murder. Some said that João de Souza had poisoned his wife using some olive oil that one of her relatives gave her. Others said that he beat her to death. Clearly two very different methods of murder, and they just can't agree. Also, two witnesses claimed that João de Souza had avoided punishment because the local judge was his friend and had not prosecuted him. But there's a problem with this. Under Inquisitional laws, murder was not a crime the Inquisition investigated. That's a secular thing. It didn't have anything to do with the Inquisition. Being of Jewish descent was also not a crime. Now, being a Jew, being a person who practiced Judaism in secret as a baptized Christian, that was a crime. But he was also accused of beating an image of Christ. That was a crime that the Inquisition would prosecute. And yet, João Eduardo never pursues either one of these two crimes that he could have pursued. Instead, he pursues this issue of him murdering his wife, which had nothing to do with the Inquisition. So clearly, there's a problem here. And people are kind of starting to realize there's something not right. He completely failed to go after the obvious issues that the Inquisition would have been interested in, and instead pursues one that had nothing to do with Inquisitional jurisdiction. Well, after he receives all these testimonies, denunciations, what João Eduardo does is he orders a mestizo, whose name is Antonio Soares dos Santos, to summon 6 or 7 people from the local community, and they then go to João de Souza's house and they arrest him. Now, there's, again, some major errors here. The Inquisition never acted this way. If they were going to arrest somebody, they would use their own familiares, if they could. If they couldn't, they used the local secular authorities, the local militia, the local colonels. Those are the people they would send. They certainly would not send a mixed-race mestizo who did not live up to the purity of blood requirements of any official of the Inquisition that was required at this time. And they certainly didn't summon people from the local town to go make the arrest. They summoned legitimate secular authorities to do it. And yet, he's not doing this. So what happens is they capture João de Souza, they sequester all of his goods, which means they're stealing all his stuff, and they make an inventory of everything he has. And it turns out that João de Souza is actually doing pretty well for a Manioc farmer in this region. He had a lot of gold and silver objects in his house. He had about 56,000 hays in coin. He had 3 letters of credit. He had 18 slaves, 60 pigs, and more than 100 cattle, and a whole bunch of furniture and clothing inside his house. João Eduardo collected all this stuff up, made a list of what he had, and then delivered it to a man named Bartolomeo Martins, and said, "I want you to hold on to all this stuff until I request it." But again, this is not the way the Inquisition functioned. Comisarios couldn't make these orders. Those orders had to come directly from Lisbon, and yet he's already doing it anyway. So what happens is João Eduardo then decides he's going to take all the gold and silver and the money to pay for the journey to Salvador. He's going to haul João de Souza all the way from the interior in the Sertão, all the way to Salvador Bahia, and turn him over to the Inquisitor. He also takes his letters of credit that were owed by men who lived in Bahia, Salvador Bahia. He was clearly going to try and collect João de Souza's credit for him. Of the 56,000 hays that he actually took, in money, only 2,000 hays remained at the end of the journey, with no accounting of where the money was spent. So where did it go? Well, it paid for the food, it paid for any passengers, and also was probably used to bribe people to stay with it. Because already the front that he's creating is starting to fracture. So in January of 1740, the Inquisition sent an investigation to the Comisario Antonio Rodriguez Lima, and he was supposed to do this investigation. This is after João Eduardo has already been captured. So I'm moving ahead in time, but it's relevant for what's happening here. Because Francisco Ferreira was the Comisario who was asked to do this investigation. And he then went to the place where he had captured João de Souza, and he opened an investigation in January, and the investigation lasted for 5 days, from January 13th to January 18th. What Francisco Ferreira collected contradicted everything Joaquim Marques claimed about what was going on here. in fact, was probably happening was Juan de Sousa was probably not guilty of any of the crimes he'd been accused of, but instead he was the target of a vendetta by the local people. As the wealthy landlord, these people said that they were angry at him because he wasn't lending out money to people who requested it, and he was also selling his manioc flour at higher than market value prices, even during a time of famine. So several witnesses also testified that when they questioned Johnny Waddy regarding his authority to imprison Juan de Sousa, he showed them the medallion of the familiar as his proof. He couldn't show them a commission because he didn't have one. He couldn't show it in his letter of appointment because he didn't have one. All he had was this medallion. Bartolomeo Martins Fejeda, the man to whom Johnny Waddy had delivered Juan de Sousa's goods, said that he only obeyed Johnny Waddy because he had that medallion. And the medallion convinced him that he was probably an inquisitional official, and that's the only reason he actually agreed to hold the goods. Other witnesses had questioned the truthfulness of the denunciations. Some said that Juan de Sousa was really an old Christian, and that the rumor of him beating his wife, or beating the image of Christ and beating his wife, came from a scoundrel who did not have a good public reputation and could not be trusted. Other witnesses said they had gone to Juan de Sousa's slaves and asked them if any of this is true. And even his slaves denied that he was guilty of any of these crimes. So this questioning demonstrates that there is more at play here than a simple manifestation of popular fear of the Inquisition. It reveals a really complex interplay between social class structures, inquisitional authority, self-interest, and what might be called the moral economy of the backlands. So Father Francisco Fejeda challenged the legitimacy of Juan de Sousa's imprisonment because he said, I was his priest. I knew him personally. And yeah, he got into trouble. He was a licentious man. But when I corrected him, he always accepted the correction with grace. He also said, I was his wife's confessor. And his wife was a devout Catholic. If she believed her husband was guilty of heresy, she would have told me, which she apparently never did. So Father Francisco said, this is all incorrect. It's all a joke. It's not true. He had also received a letter from the Dominican convent in Salvador Bahia indicating that Johnny Waddy was, in fact, an apostate who had been traveling for 3 years with a woman of ill repute. This is the only time in all the records that this woman is mentioned. So I don't have any evidence to show that she was actually there or not, but given his other behavior, it wouldn't be surprising. In addition to this, the Archbishop João Fialho of Pernambuco had ordered Father Francisco to capture Johnny Waddy when he was back there in the region originally, but Johnny Waddy had gotten away. He'd hidden his location and he snuck off and slipped away to Bahia, and Father Francisco never got a hold of him. So clearly, what's going on here is Johnny Waddy has become a pawn in local power plays. Local people are using him to get revenge on a wealthy landowner that they didn't like. So following the arrest, Johnny Waddy's behavior starts to become even more uncharacteristic of an inquisitional official. It was already pretty bad, but it gets worse. By presenting himself to the same general audience with this contradictory front, he's making it even more difficult for even the unsophisticated Sertanejos to place him, to recognize him for what he claims to be. By the time he set out for Salvador, with Juan de Sousa in tow, even those who knew him well and knew him only as an official of Inquisition began to find his behavior discrediting, and many of them began fleeing, trying to escape Johnny Waddy. So he recognized his position is fracturing and it's weakening. He also knows he needs stronger evidence against Juan de Sousa. So soon after the arrest, he found one of de Sousa's neighbors and said, well, I'm going to question this guy and see if he can give me more information on Juan de Sousa. But instead of doing it to an inquisitional official would do, which would be simply to summon him into his presence and then ask him the question, he captures the man, arrests him, puts him in shackles, brings him in, and then questions him. Turns out the guy didn't know anything, so it was a total waste of time. So he says, well, this isn't going to work. I've got to come up with a new crime. I have to do something else. And yet again, he completely ignores the obvious crime of whipping an image of Christ. He doesn't even go there. Instead, he gets a golden reliquary like this one. What kind of reliquary, I don't know exactly, but it was a golden reliquary. And he says, well, I'm going to come up with a crime that is relevant to the Inquisition and see if I can make this stick. So he stages a dramatic revelation on October 12, 1739, in front of witnesses whom he also required to give sworn testimony and sign their testimonies. And he said that he found an unconsecrated object inside the reliquary. So he said, this is what he said in his testimony. He said, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I found a small reliquary of silk in one of Jean de Souza's Pereira's baskets. Upon opening it, I found a small piece of white paper sticking out with a seal on it. Upon opening the lock, I found a tiny object kept in a chalice. And Jean Duadio claimed that Joan de Souza was keeping this in there as a way of mocking the sacraments. So he had this big declaration, people signed it, and then Jean Duadio hung the reliquary around Joan de Souza's neck and made him march with it the rest of the journey all the way back into Salvador Bahia. So this is, by the way, this is illegal. You can't fake crimes for the Inquisition and get away with it if you get caught. So about 8 days later, as they're marching towards Salvador with his company of people in tow, they stop at a village called Aguas Frias, and Jean Duadio begins sending out letters summoning people to come join him to kind of act as a guard, to scare people away from him. In fact, one of Jean de Souza's relatives, his cousin, found out he'd been in prison, and he armed 25 men, and they came after Jean Duadio. But when they got there and they saw the huge crowd around Jean Duadio, they took fright and fled, and never actually rescued Jean de Souza. So Jean Duadio understands he's protecting himself by summoning all these people. But again, this isn't something a Commissar de Inquisition would have done. Well, in Aguas Frias, he finds a man named Manuel Alves, who was a school teacher in the village. And he summoned him to join him. But Manuel Alves said, no, I don't want to go with you. And he wouldn't hit. So Jean Duadio stopped the company, and they went after him. They found Manuel Alves, captured him, he chastised him, and forced him to join his company. About 2 or 3 leagues later, Jean Duadio discovers that Manuel Alves has gone again. He stops the whole company, turns them all around, goes back to Aguas Frias, and searches for the guy. He finds him hiding in a basket, because Manuel Alves knew that Jean was going to come after him, which he did. So he takes him then, and they march all the way to a sugar plantation called Pujuca, and there they take a rest, and Jean Duadio calls Manuel to his presence, and informs all his followers that Manuel has incurred the gravest ecclesiastical censure for having fled after being notified by the Inquisition. And so Jean Duadio commences to excommunicate Manuel from the church. And he also ordered him to stand nude before the entire congregation in the church of Orizangas on 3 separate holy days. So here as elsewhere, Jean Duadio is actually engaging in a more medieval and theatrical application of punishment than was current in the Portuguese Inquisition. These kind of punishments aren't being handed down here. Those kind of punishments did occur in the 16th and some in the 17th, but not in the mid-18th century. So, likewise, commissarios also had no authority to punish anyone of any kind without a commission directly from the Inquisition. So several days later, more of his followers begin to desert. And Jean Duadio kind of goes crazy, trying to manage this. He tries to get them. He sends out people to look for them. He only managed to collect 3 of them, and then he excommunicates the rest and sends out letters to all the parish priests to arrest them and punish them if they're found. So again, clearly he started to escalate his behavior. He started to try and exert greater power, even though he doesn't really have it. So finally, they arrive and at the Rio San Francisco, where Jean Duadio is able to take a boat. This is November 8, 1739, and then cross over to Bahia. And this is the day he arrives at the house of the Comisario Antonio Rodriguez Lima, around 11 or 12 o'clock at night. And he delivers to him his prisoner, the papers and reliquary, and remaining money from Jean de Souza, and then he goes off. So the Comisario says, look, come back tomorrow. But what happened, Jean Duadio went and rented a house where he was actively writing letters when he was captured. So he was sending out more letters to go punish the people who had abandoned him on the trip back to Salvador Bahia. But in the meantime, some of about 12 or 13 of the people who had marched to Salvador Bahia with him went directly to the Viceroy's palace. The Viceroy's name was André Gemelo de Costa. He was the Count of Galdeas. And they complained about Jean Duadio's conduct. The Viceroy then ordered the magistrates to go and arrest Jean Duadio. Now there's a question here. I don't know what he's arrested for. It's not clear. Which crime? Because he committed quite a few. Which one's going to get arrested for it? It's not clear at all. I mean, he'd already opened the king's mail, which was against the law. He had collected alms without a license. He'd sold indulgences without a license. And he'd also been a fake priest. But the reason why he ends up in the clutches of the Inquisition is because by Portuguese law, inquisitional jurisdiction took precedence over all of the jurisdictions. So that's why the Inquisition gets it. So on the evening of Monday, November 9th, the guards enter the house where Januario is residing. They imprison him, they take all his goods, and then they ship him off to the Discalced Carmelite convent here in Bahia. So Januario's got a problem. He's managed to avoid capture for about 4.5 years. But now, when he took a pause in the center of royal authority in Bahia, he gets captured. And his front is now starting to crumble. So he does what he normally does. When things start to fall apart, he tries to escape. He spent 2 or 3 different ways trying to get out of the convent. And his last effort almost got him out. He got all the way to the front door before the guard realized who he was and stopped him and arrested him and sent him back in. So the convent here, as you can see from the picture, is actually situated on an escarpment that looks over a wide bay. When Januario, after many failed attempts to escape, finally got so depressed, he climbed onto a window and launched himself over the escarpment. So he's basically trying to commit suicide here, it appears. Well, the Carmelites find him down on the rocks, all broken now. He has a broken arm and a broken leg. He was unconscious, so he probably had a serious concussion as well. But when he finally wakes up after several days, he decides he's going to stage a confession. So he calls on January 21st, 1740, he calls the Comisario, Antonio Rodriguez Lima, to his side and says, I'm going to confess. And in front of witnesses, he confesses that he had placed the host in the reliquary and that João de Souza was actually innocent. So notice what he's not confessing. All the other stuff he's not confessing. He's only confessing to falsifying the evidence in the reliquary. And then, at the bottom of his confession, in a very neat hand, he wrote, Friar José de Gareta. He's still trying to pass as José de Gareta. So he doesn't know what they know yet, right? So he's still trying to play the game, see if he can pull it off. See if he can only be punished for this one crime instead of all the other crimes he's also committed. So, the Comisario Antonio Rodriguez finally sends him off to Lisbon, where he's sent away to trial. And he ends up at the Inquisitional Palace. He's held in the prison there. Meanwhile, José de Souza, the guy he illegally imprisoned in Bahia, was stuck in prison until July of 1740. So he had to spend half a year in prison before he finally got out. The viceroy convinced the Comisario to let him go. But sometime on the journey from Bahia all the way to Lisbon, Januario decided he was going to try a new tactic. This time he was going to actually make a full-fledged confession. So the day after his arrival in Lisbon, he requested an audience with the inquisitors. They admitted him to their chambers, and he gave them 27 pages, handwritten pages of verbal testimony, duly recorded by the notary, giving an account of all of the crimes he'd committed. Then they called him back and forth. They spent about 8 months interrogating him, questioning him, and sending out investigations to Bahia and Recife to try and find out more information. And in all that time, what he's trying to do is he's trying to present a matter-of-fact kind of confession where he willingly admits his crimes, but then he also tries to do it in a way that will elicit the sympathy of the inquisitors. He says, look, I engaged in these crimes, it's true, but I did it because of the great misery of my labor in the convent. I did it because I wanted the respect and esteem of the priest and of the Inquisition. It was the devil that tempted me, and I just caved into the temptation. Problem is, these inquisitors are far more sophisticated audience than anybody else Joaquin Marquez has tried this on. And they also had access to all the other information about him, the investigations that were going on. They chose to interpret his behavior in a much more negative light. They accused him of not only misconduct, but also of heresy. The heresy he was guilty of was the heretical belief that any member of the Catholic fold could administer the Holy Sacraments. So this is a heresy, and that's what they basically got him for. They also claimed that his real motive was that he disliked the Inquisition and wanted to bring the good name of the Inquisition into ill repute. So they punished him. They sent the Januario to appear in an auto de fe with objuração de vehemente suspeita. This is the vehemently suspect, which means this is serious. He's guilty of heresy, and he's going to have to make a public confession of his crimes. They also banished him to the galleys for 10 years. So if you don't know what the galleys are, I put a picture of the galley up there. This means he has to be one of the rowers in the galleys. This was quite common, and it was 10 years was really a death sentence. If he didn't die from the exertions of labor, he'd probably die from a piratical attack of some kind out there in the Mediterranean. So he's also told that he is now unqualified to ever receive sacred orders, which shouldn't surprise anyone, given his conduct. But he was also told he had to repay all that money he had stolen, and he had to pay for the cost of his trial, which amounted to 3,412 days. And he was supposed to receive spiritual penance and instruction. Now, of course, you could always ask, how is he supposed to pay for this if he's stuck as a prisoner on a galley? And the answer is, well, yeah, exactly. He can't pay for any of this. But still, they make that, that's part of his punishment. In addition to this, they also sent out letters to all the parish priests in the interior in the Sertão saying, that guy who was passing as Jose de Gareta was not a legitimate priest, and now you have to redo all the work he did. If you confess to him, you got to go do a legitimate confession now. If he baptized you, you got to go have somebody else do the baptism. And so the waves of chaos that were in his wake took years to finally settle down and even out. Well, the Inquisitors then declared the trial concluded on May 30th, 1741, and then on July 18th, 1741, Januario appeared in the auto de fe at the Dominican convent in Lisbon. So, what does all this mean? Januario's story is compelling, not just because he subverts social categories, but also because he manipulates them and reinforces them so successfully for so long. In a sense, he was a kind of normal exception, an ordinary extraordinary. He's breaking the rules of society in ordinary ways, but he's doing it in an extraordinary way as well. So he's also punished in accordance with the laws that were set up to deal with these kind of ordinary deviants. So in many ways, he's kind of reinforces the systems of power that he got himself entangled in. Januario's arrest also did not occur on the orders of the Inquisition. This is something we need to remember. The colonial system was based on competing power brokers whose jurisdictions overlapped and whose power could either be formidable or weak, depending on the circumstances, depending on the economic, social, political circumstances of the region. So sometimes, because we live in what we might call modern enlightened societies, where we expect secular religious authority to be separate, we often forget that in this society they were not separate. The Inquisition was a royal tribunal, as much as it was a papal tribunal. Bishops still held authority over the crimes of heresy in their dioceses. And they could all, both the bishops and the Inquisition, could call upon secular authorities to enforce their edicts. So we have to remember this. Sometimes secular ecclesiastical authority actually resided in the same individual as when bishops were governors of the provinces, of the Captains General, which also happened. So we see a close cooperation here between the secular authorities, the viceroy in this case, and the ecclesiastical authorities. Remember, it was the viceroy who ordered his arrest. It was the Carmelites who held him in prison. It was the Inquisition who accused him, tried him, and punished him. And it was secular authorities who carried out the inquisitional sentence. So this reveals the nature of inquisitional power here. It's a power that could not function on its own. It required other power brokers and power holders to interact with it, intersect with it in various ways. His story also reveals that the wheels of colonial bureaucracy could turn slowly, right? Especially in the frontier. He gets away with this for 4.5 years, which is unusual, but he still does it. And so these inefficiencies of distance, the low numbers of officials, the acquiescence of the local population, all of this could play into the hands of imposters like Januario. And yet, he still gets captured. He still gets punished. So at the same time we have this kind of weak system, it still works, and it can still get you eventually, even though it might be slow. Also, inquisitional power here, even when it's falsified, also proves sufficient to protect him for a long time. People refused to act against him because they were worried that he might actually be an inquisitional official. And if they had offended the Inquisition, then they would be the next target. And so, because of the real nature of inquisitional power, this could actually fall into, sort of work in his favor. But as Joachim Marques began to elaborate even more greatly upon his false identity, he really came up against the difficult reality of power. And that is that power ultimately resides in the perception that the individual or the institution can enforce their objectives. But that perception always relies on the effective use of force when necessary. And Joachim Marques couldn't muster it. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how many summons he sent out, no matter how many people he excommunicated, he still couldn't muster the real force necessary to back up the authority he professed to have. So, but what this does do, I think, is it challenges the old myth of the Inquisition as well. This old idea that we have this all-powerful, universally feared, official Inquisition could get away with whatever they wanted. That myth fades in the face of the documentary evidence. Joachim managed to escape the constraints and regulations of the church, partly because he was on a maturing frontier, partly because he was in an area where he had a wide variety of unexploited audiences he could present a new front to as he moved around. And as long as he kept on the move, he was okay. It's when he stopped that he got into trouble, because people who had more familiarity with him began to recognize the cracks in his front. And when he stopped in Bahia, even for 2 days, he was finally captured, even though people have been trying to capture him now for several years at this point. So even then, he didn't give up the game, though, right? He continued, he staged a false confession. He also went to the Inquisitors and tried to get their mercy from them. So he was still trying to play the game as long as he possibly could. But by breaking the normal limits of behavior in a colonial society, defined by custom and the legal framework imposed by the Crown and the Inquisition, and doing so in predictable ways, what John Eduardo actually did was reinforce those very limits. And by choosing to operate in the Sertão, he expanded his opportunities for imposture and removed himself effectively from the area of greatest colonial control, which was the cities along the coast. And at the same time, though, one thing we have to mention is he was manipulated as much as he was manipulated. The João de Sousa story shows that the local folks recognized the nature of inquisitional power, saw Januário as a target, and manipulated him to engage in a vendetta against somebody they didn't like. So, the story's not over yet, though. Januário's story didn't end with his trial and punishment. In January of 1744, 2.5 years after being sent to the galleys, Januário began petitioning the Inquisition for a commutation of his sentence. This is something else that has not been widely studied by the Inquisition. Many people got their sentences commuted. This is something somebody needs to study at some point, because it has not been studied. But he does this, and he claims that his health has deteriorated so badly that he can no longer serve in the galleys. So the Inquisitors send 2 physicians out to investigate in early February. And they find, both of them report that Januário at this point is suffering from a high fever. He has a bloated belly, and his left shoulder is dislocated, and his left leg broken. So he does appear to be in pretty bad condition. These injuries may have been something that was leftover complication from his fall from the Carmelite convent. Don't know. He also might have been involved in combat on the Mediterranean, which is also entirely possible. We just don't know. The physicians, though, were skeptical about his claims that his right leg was also crippled, which he also claimed. So they said, well, we don't think it really crippled, he's faking. So the Inquisitors accepted the physician's report, and then on February 21st, they decided to send Januário to the Dominican convent in Elvas. You can see where it is. That's the remains of it there. Most of it's gone now, but you can see what the city of Elvas is on the borders of Portugal and Spain. They send him there for safekeeping while they decide to deliberate on his case. Then on October 23rd, 1744, the Inquisitors finally decide to get rid of Januário once and for all. So they send orders to the prior of the Dominican convent in Elvas to call Januário to his presence, to reprimand him severely, and then to banish him from the Portuguese Empire and its dominions forever. But their decision came too late. At 8 o'clock in the morning on October 24th, the friars of the Dominican convent found that Januário had escaped.
Oh my God.
They couldn't find him. He was just gone. On October 30th, the prior wrote a letter to the Inquisition informing them that they still couldn't find him, and they had no news of where he had fled. So the ever-resourceful Januário disappeared. The end of the historical record. Maybe his experience reformed him. but I'm not convinced. If you look at where Elvis is, I think what he did was he just walked across the border into Spain. He spoke Spanish. Did he continue with Jose de Igarata? I don't know. I actually did do a search of the Inquisitional records in Spain. It wasn't a deep search because they're hard to search from the outside, but I looked around, I tried to find any evidence of him, but I found nothing. I assume he took on a new biography, a new identity, and probably went on as a new imposter somewhere else in Spain.
That's incredible.
That's the end of the story. Time for questions? If anybody wants to ask?
I definitely have a burning question. Are you ready to write the screenplay for this? I can see Benedict Cumberbatch's.
Right. Well, yeah, he'd be good, wouldn't he?
It's quite the story.
Yeah, it's a yarn is what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
What do you think his motivation was? Just power?
He said that he was tired of laboring in the convent. He said he was jealous of the prestige and honor that people had, and he just couldn't get it. The question is, why couldn't he be ordained? He came from a family that should have been able to afford it. I think that people just figured out that there was something not right with this guy.
Oh.
That's my guess. I'm only guessing though. There's no evidence to suggest one way or the other. We only know his claim. The Inquisitors insisted that he did it because he wanted to embarrass the Inquisition. But that doesn't seem reasonable. I think it probably was that he was tired of cleaning the toilets, and he was tired of washing the dishes and changing the linen, and he wanted to do something that he thought was more up to his standard. He wanted to be a priest. He wanted to have the honor and dignity of being a priest.
You also, I used to think the Inquisition was much more indiscriminate than you painted it. I mean, they really seemed to go by the rules.
Yeah,
which surprised me.
They had clear bylaws, and those bylaws were by and large enforced. Now, were there people who abused it? Yes, they do exist, but it's not the kind of rampant abuse that we're often led to believe. So, I mean, just in terms of just Portuguese Inquisition, just in terms of execution, the Portuguese Inquisition in 285 years of existence, prosecuting well over 40,000 individuals, actually executed in terms of physically killed, about 700. Now, one is too many, obviously, but 700 is not the kind of death machine we're led to believe the Inquisition was.
Right.
It just isn't. The vast majority of people who were prosecuted by the Inquisition were reconciled to the church, because that was the point. The whole point of the Inquisition was to get people who had unorthodox beliefs and behaviors and correct them and bring them back into the fold of Christ. That was the whole idea. So, could they be brutal about it? Yeah, they could. And if you got caught in the clutches, it sure didn't feel very. It didn't really matter what the numbers are, right? I mean, you were still caught in the clutches. But the reality is that in the broad scale of things, it wasn't nearly as lethal as we're led to believe.
I also didn't realize that they interacted with the civil government.
The Inquisition was a royal tribunal. It was established in both the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, were royal tribunals established by royal authority with permission from the papacy.
Oh, that's interesting.
So they had a dual identity. They were papal inquisitions, but they were also royal institutions. They were a tribunal of the crown. And in fact, in both Spain and Portugal, the king had a role in appointing the Inquisitor General. I mean, it differs. In Spain, the king actually appointed the Inquisitor General with permission of the papacy. In Portugal, they recommended them to the papacy. The papacy appointed them. But still, the crown is the one who appointed the Inquisitor General in both of the empires.
Well, I learned a lot, and I too am waiting for the movie.
Yes, me too.
I need a playwright.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you so much on behalf of all of us for that incredibly fascinating account, and also the last 10 minutes of putting it in that larger